Alrighty, everyone. Hello, good morning, and thank you for being here. The presentation today that I'm going to cover is really talking about what data that we have at Uber Freight can tell us about an infrastructure investment strategy that will allow us to unlock electrification. So before we get started, a little bit about myself. My name is Chinmay. I work in a partnerships and strategy role at Uber Freight. I've been there for about 5 years now. And prior to that, I was working as a management consultant doing a lot of work with infrastructure investments in the telecom, media, and technology space. So really looking at data centers, looking at fiber infrastructure, and cell towers. And I think a lot of what we learned back when we were doing the methodology for those kinds of infrastructure projects and investments really cross applies to electrification infrastructure. Outside of electrification at Uber Freight, some of my focus areas include Gen AI, which is super exciting space to be working on these days, and also data partnerships, in addition to more broadly sustainability topics. So let's dive into today's content. So 4 key questions that we're asking and answering today, and I'll caveat this by saying that I have the most robust data set possible for the United States, and I do not have that for Canada. So one of the things that I would like to do today is highlight the methodology and the way we think about answering these questions. But I think that there's going to be a ton of folks here in the audience and at the conference who have even better data than I do in Canada to be able to take the same methodology and thinking, apply it to the regional perspectives that we're going to see here in Canada. So what are we asking and answering today? Really thinking about what is the right strategy to deploy infrastructure for a zero emissions freight future. Thinking about which routes, which cities are most feasible, how do we identify what routes and what cities are feasible for electrification, determining the optimal charger location, and then lastly, if we have some time, I would love to talk a little bit about how partnerships can help us succeed in this space. So before we dive into the methodology and EV infrastructure topic for today, I wanted to give a little bit of an overview about Uber Freight because it's important for you all to understand what perspective I'm coming at this problem from. There's a lot of different perspectives, a lot of right ways to think about the problem. There's charging infrastructure developers. There are motor carriers and drivers who are running trucks. There are OEMs, and all of those different perspectives are captured here at this conference. The Uber Freight perspective is interesting because we sit as part of a much broader organization, Uber, which many of you are familiar with for our Uber Rides or Uber Delivery products that you might use as a consumer. And Uber Freight itself really has 2 major components to it. The first is a digital brokerage, which is really, driving and pushing the boundaries of automation and efficiency in the brokerage space. So how can we have, a lot of network efficiency, dynamic pricing, and things like that to connect marketplace between shippers and carriers. And then the second big component of Uber Freight is a transportation management network. So how do we act on behalf of a shipper to manage end-to-end their entire supply chain? What that really means is there's about a total of about $18 to $20 billion of freight under management that we have a purview over. Some of that's running through the brokerage, some of that's running through the managed transportation org, and hundreds of thousands of trucks that are on the network that we're working with. So the economics of EVs are heavily use case dependent, and I won't spend a ton of time on this slide because I think this is an audience that's pretty familiar with electric vehicles and some of the roadblocks and challenges that electric vehicles face. but I did want to level set on the fact that there is no magical date sometime in the future where the TCO equation, suddenly works. There are certainly, many tailwinds and a few headwinds that we face, but there is no magical date where the economics, suddenly work. There are good ideas today. There are ideas that are almost good today that might shift in the future to becoming good ideas because some of those tailwinds, push it over the edge. But we can analyze today and understand today what are the best opportunities for electrification and start working on those. And then maybe the breadth of what we're working on changes over time because some of those fundamental assumptions will adapt and change as technology advances, or some of the tailwinds help push that to be a profitable business case. Really, the challenge with battery electric trucks today is that there is a limited number of applications where they can replace diesel trucks one-to-one. Not all battery electric trucks can just be swapped in for a diesel truck because you have limitations on your range and limitations on your weight. Those are the two biggest limitations. And the range limitation really translates into an hours of service limitation at the end of the day because you need to charge and you're wasting some of the time that a driver could be driving paid loaded miles with that charging. The second big piece here, the biggest piece to the TCO equation, I think, is really around the upfront capex necessary and the current environment of capital not being free. Money was free a few years ago, and that's dramatically changed. So today, having a very high capex investment upfront means you have to have financing partners that you can work with. The residual value of EVs being a little bit unknown today makes that challenging. The depreciation of the assets makes that challenging. So your biggest change in battery electric vehicle cost versus diesel truck costs is that depreciation line item, right? There's some favorability on maintenance. There's some favorability on fuel, electricity prices. The charging infrastructure is expensive, but it's not a deal breaker in many cases. With high enough utilization, the charging infrastructure can be successfully deployed. But it's really that depreciation of the assets and the fact that lenders are not super sure how to lend money to the right people to make these capex investments, and also the fact that the residual value of these assets is a little bit unknown. So let's dive into the meat of today's presentation. Really, I want to share a methodology that Uber Freight has used to identify which routes, which cities are most feasible for electrification, and how do we actually fast forward through the next 10, 15, 20 years to understand how that strategy of infrastructure deployment will play out over time. So what we've done here is really take the data that we have, that $18 billion of freight under management that I mentioned, which represents annually about 500,000 loads that we're shipping. And it also includes all of the operational details, shipper facility locations at a very granular level. It includes charging time that might be necessary because we know what the shipper appointments are and the delivery windows of those facilities, their hours of operation, things like that. So the really detailed data is foundational to being able to run this model that we have created, to be able to tell us which routes, which facilities, which cities are most eligible for electrification. And then out of scope, but very worth calling out, because I think that this is where the methodology sort of breaks down, and we need to take that one step further when actually developing a plan, and not just a strategy, but an actual roadmap for electrification. Things like grid readiness or a throughput concern per site. What we're going to see later in the presentation is, me telling you a certain number of sites can service a whole geography. But I haven't told you that, one lane going in and out of a parking lot is not going to be enough to service the throughput of that particular site. So these are really real concerns around parking, land availability, proximity to highways, even amenities that drivers will need. And this is where the modeled approach needs to be combined with an actual, very granular understanding of a geography, of a city, and this is where, honestly, sometimes when we're thinking about deployments, we go and talk to the drivers to really understand their nuanced understanding of traffic flows and how they get in and out of a highway, and local roads that they're able to actually drive on when servicing accounts in a particular region. The conclusions that we drew from this, and I'm about to switch to a map view where this will be a little bit more evident, really three main conclusions, and we'll go into more detail on each of these. Right, the first is this concept of hubs to highway. So keep it simple initially, right? Pick the routes, pick the applications where EVs will succeed off the bat, where we're not necessarily thinking about on route, on highway charging, but we're thinking about a return to base, return to depot type charging. But the hubs alone do not solve our problem. We will need to move to the highways as part of the strategy, and we'll see why. Today's technology already solves for the earliest applications. It solves for the short hauls. And there's a high percentage of loads that are actually occurring that can be run with today's EV technology. And lastly, only a few charger locations are actually needed. And again, this is where, maybe throughput concerns for a site or the geographical nuances of a city are going to change this answer. And you might actually have, 3 sites on a particular intersection. But technically, you only need a few sites to have that geographical optimization where you're able to service the major metro areas. And we'll look at that consolidation. Really here, what we're thinking about is, do you have a charger site that's within 10 miles of your shipper origin or your shipper destination facility to enable electrification? So let's take a look at what this actually looks like visually. On the left-hand side, you're going to see the load distribution that we're looking at. This particular chart shows the local haul analysis. So this is all routes that are less than 150 miles in length. What we also consider here is, end-to-end freight. So if you look at a route that is maybe 300 to 500 miles, can you service that with one charger that's sort of an intermediate point charger? But not necessarily looking at a road segment like here in the Midwest, some of the gray lines on the right-hand side. Not looking at those road segments because they might have a very high density of freight that's moving over them, a lot of trucks that are moving over them, but those trucks are actually just traversing that road segment while going cross-country. So maybe a 3,000 mile length of haul, which is not as feasible for early electrification. So phase 0 on the left-hand side, very obviously there's a few of these clusters that are optimal locations for a hub where there's a no-brainer amount of freight in that hub. It's very easy to figure out where those hubs should be. And then phases 1 through 4 on the right-hand side here, really connecting those hubs in mini networks that enable end-to-end freight. So the red hubs that you're seeing here on the right-hand side, those are places where we can actually service that demand end-to-end. It's not freight that's passing through one of those mini networks. And then going over to the yellow, really connecting a lot of the eastern side of the United States, and finally green and gray in the subsequent phases. So phase 0, right? Why do we even start with the hub locations? Well, really what we're saying here is that the path to electrification is going to be built on successes and milestones that we can notch today. And being able to start with the use cases that are solvable by battery electric trucks today is going to give us the learnings to be able to go ahead and scale that technology and implement that into the future. So avoiding, complex on-route charging coordination, for example, getting started with just a single charger. On the right-hand side, I have a picture of some of the ports, right? Drayage is a prime example of a use case that is sort of a self-contained ecosystem, also has something very convenient with typically first come, first serve appointment times, which are easier to coordinate given the charging time is another added variable, another added constraint in the battery electric space. The energy is probably more available closer to some of these hubs of density, and we're really trying to achieve high utilization. That's the goal here because that makes all the economics work a little bit better. And the hub strategy is also key because these hubs that we're building today are going to continue to be addressable far into the future. It's not like we're going to be building hubs and then need to switch to build highway chargers or on-route chargers. The hubs are part of the highway strategy. And so that's why you build through the hub into whatever's next. So really what I've done here is played around with the assumptions for battery electric truck eligibility. It's a little bit hard to talk over a moving GIF, but the first image that you're seeing with the least amount of green routes is assuming 150-mile total truck range. We're starting to see different OEMs come out with different ranges of trucks. And you can believe what you want to believe, but I cycle here through 150 miles, a 250-mile chart, and a 400-mile chart. And what you can see is in the 150-mile chart, there's still some addressable locations. Windsor, Toronto, all the way up to Montreal, and the corridor sort of connecting that is very interesting. As we start looking at a 400-mile range truck, you start seeing a lot of cross-border loads that are connecting Windsor through New York or Windsor through Chicago. And cross-border freight accounts for a very large portion, actually, of Canadian shipments. There's a lot of cross-border trade between the US and Canada. So really thinking about that as an extension, as we actually develop this technology and we see what's next, we'll be able to adapt our strategy and our charger locations to account for the increases that we might see in truck range over time. So I mentioned earlier that only a few chargers are really necessary to unlock a hub location. And let me dive a little bit deeper into that. So I've picked some of the densest hubs here on the left-hand side. These 10 locations that are the densest hubs represent 60-70% of the short-haul freight in the United States. So these hubs are important. Some of these hubs, like Dallas-Fort Worth, actually have an incredible amount of urban sprawl. They're just very large geographical cities or a pair of cities, and they just sort of continue going on for forever in every direction. The chart on the left here is really highlighting that to get to more than 50% addressability of the local shipments in any one of these markets, we really only need 3 chargers. And look, there's probably going to be more than 3 chargers because these chargers would have to be very large if there were just 3 of them. But the locations, the geographical spread of this is really saying you don't need a ton of locations to be close enough to a shipper facility to actually service that demand. On the right-hand side, what you're seeing is 10 or so illustrative chargers in the Dallas region in a modeled optimizer that will show where should those 10 chargers actually go to unlock close to 95% of the addressable miles in that particular geography. Again, this is a modeled approach, not a real-world approach. I actually corrected this chart on the right here because one of the models put a charger optimal location in the middle of water. So, this is the nuances that we'll have to think about. Some of these chargers, might be actually better if they were less optimally located and actually closer to the highway. So these are some of the considerations that we have to think through when actually going to the actual plan of electrification versus a strategy around how do we electrify. So short hauls are the starting point, but as I mentioned earlier, they don't move the needle alone. So if we were able to electrify all of the short hauls, that represents 30–40% of shipments, but it only represents a few percent of the total miles driven, which is a really good proxy for the total amount of emissions that we actually see in a geography, is the total miles, the ton miles of freight driven. What we really need to do is establish these mini networks that change the addressable range of an EV shipment from 150 miles to 300 to 500 miles with one, maybe two on-route chargers, and still trying to maximize the amount of end-to-end freight that goes through a region. So you're not just looking at the highest throughput lanes, the fattest lines on this map. You're not looking at just the fattest lines, you're looking at the fattest lines that also have end-to-end freight within that region, that mini network. And really also this should consider state and federal, national funding, because that will make a big impact on where the business case works out best. And also like to mention at this time that we're really in a state where electrification of freight and decarbonization of freight is not going to happen with any one technology alone. So we should be leveraging all of the above, right? Deploying advanced fuels simultaneously with intermodal and rail, simultaneously with battery electric trucks, while waiting to see what other technologies might come out that will also impact our ability to move goods with less carbon emissions. Now, the full electrification plan looks a little bit daunting, phases 2 through 4. So I will say that it will take many years and the strategy will evolve, so it doesn't have to be as daunting as it looks like. This map represents about 50,000 miles of highways that need to be electrified, which sounds like a lot, but when we actually think about the total heavy-duty truck miles, half of those miles are driven on a pretty concentrated, only 1.2% of the total miles that are actually these highway miles. So there is density in the hubs, there is density on certain highway lanes, and we can leverage that density to start there and then build outwards in this sort of spider web, cracks on glass kind of approach that we're looking at. And also, new technology or state and federal investments in the light duty highway electrification or light duty and home grid system will impact this strategy. We'll be able to see how that plays out, and battery electric trucks will always be a few years behind passenger vehicles on that electrification roadmap and journey. So let's double click a little bit on one of those points that I mentioned on the last slide, range improvements again, right? When we think about the charger density, how many chargers we need per 1,000-mile of highway segment to really make electrification work, we can see that the truck range dramatically changes the amount of chargers that you actually need to address the highway miles. As we look to 200-mile truck range, which is sort of where a lot of the OEMs are today, you need to actually have about 20 chargers per 1,000 miles or more in order to enable really robust electrification through having that charging network established. There are a couple ways this can come down. One, range increases. The chart is pretty self-explanatory. You're seeing how that allows you to address a lot more of the miles with additional range. The other one is actually coordination of charging sites. So this analysis assumes there's several competitors who are deploying their own charging networks but are not coordinating with one another. Now, if there was one player that took and put chargers across an entire length of highway, or those players were to talk to each other and say, hey, let's space them out a little bit, let's space them out 100 miles apart from each other, then on a highway you don't end up with this plan that has 3 chargers at the same intersection, but maybe in a hub that actually is supported, because of the density in the hub and all of the other site concerns around throughput and things like that. So we did a lot of this research last year, pretty recently actually, about a month ago. We saw the US government publish their National Zero Emissions Freight Corridor Strategy. And similar methodology, there were two additional pieces which I loved that they considered that we did not consider. The first is, where is there disproportionate impact on local communities from trucking? And the second was state policy and how that might impact, in addition to the federal policy, the availability of grants and how that changes the strategy. But similar conclusions. Basically this hub, starting with hubs, moving into mini networks, going into the longer highways, very similar strategy, and so that was a really good thing to see, sort of a mirrored approach overall. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, I don't have enough data in Canada to really give you all an answer. So I wanted to share the methodology, the way that we think about the problem, and some of the things that I did consider when thinking about the problem here in Canada. So here are a few of the facts that I was able to find, but again, corroborated with someone who has a much better data set here would be great. Looked at population maps and saw a incredible concentration close to the border. Looked at the densest freight corridors that sort of run through Windsor, Toronto to Montreal and Quebec, the Continental Gateway, and also the cross-border volumes between Detroit and Windsor, or New York and Niagara. They account essentially for an incredible amount of the cross-border opportunities. Also looking at port locations and port volumes. There's a lot of ports right around this area, and ports tend to be a very consistent source of volume in and out, and oftentimes have sort of built-in round trips as containers need to go back to the port as they're emptied out, or have exports going out and imports coming in. So these are some of the dynamics that you look for when trying to figure out what that optimal strategy is. I did not put together a map of Canada that's similar to the maps that we've seen for the US, but I think based on that methodology, based on some of these data points, one of the obvious answers is around Toronto, Windsor, Quebec, connecting this lane and corridor. And then I think Vancouver on the other side of the country, also super interesting, purely based on the port locations available. And towards the very end here, I want to switch gears and chat a little bit about a topic that I'm super passionate about because I come from a partnerships role. If you want to know about cross-network efficiencies and how partnerships can enable that, or emissions data exchange and how we can enable that through partnerships, I'd be very happy to chat about that later. Right now, I really wanted to introduce this concept of EV infrastructure collaboration, because I think that one in particular with this audience is going to be a really great thing to discuss. There are ways to trade data across providers without exchanging any secret sauce or anything like that, but really being able to enable more complicated, more seamless, more magical EV charging experiences, better business cases with higher utilization, better public planning of where to put a location, how do you actually work with utilities, and all the nuances of actually going through this. Really, we're not alone. And that cross-network collaboration can enable a lot. And as I end this presentation, I wanted to also just give you a vision of what this can look like with that level of data sharing, with that level of software enabling that really delightful experience for someone operating an EV. So here, for example, right, taking away the driver's thinking that goes into range, taking away the driver's thinking that goes into, can I actually electrify a certain route, and can I finish the shipment? Am I going to be on time? And really putting all of that into the software here. Getting you hooked up with a charger location, giving you a charging plan, how long should you charge, when should you charge during the day, doing the right kind of matching of trips based on charger availability, payments, all of this is really necessary and possible with software. So with that, wanted to say thank you to everybody for listening, and feel free to catch me sometime at the conference to say hello and ask any questions. Really appreciate it.